What is your name and where are you from?
My name is Barry Spitz. I live in San Anselmo for the last 50 years, and the Dipsea Race finish line announcer for since 1982.
Um, so I was going to ask, what is your connection to the Dipsea Race?
I wrote a history of the race called Dipsea: The Greatest Race, and I do have a little apology at the beginning to the Boston Marathon because I didn't want to name the book Dipsea: The Second Greatest Race, so this is how I handle it. And as I say, I've been the announcer at the finish line for over 40 years, and I've put on reunions, I've organized reunions, and I'm very proud of that the book has, when the book was written, there were a lot of attacks by bureaucrats that maybe the Dipsea shouldn't continue. And now I feel the Dipsea is on firm footing. Although I must say in the last year or two, I'm not as 100% confident that my work is guaranteed another 100 years, but we'll see.
Okay.
I won't see, but you'll see.
Okay, so we haven't asked, what is the Dipsea Race?
The Dipsea Race began in 1905 as a cross-country run. It remains one of the oldest cross-country runs, possibly the oldest in the United States. There maybe were some tiny ones that are older, but Boston Marathon began in 1896 for some comparison, and Beta Breakers began in 1912 to put it in some context. But the Dipsea has some unique features, which I certainly hope you ask me about. But the handicap, of course, makes it really stand out. But it goes from Mill Valley, where we're sitting. Actually, the starting line is very, very close to the town of Stinson Beach, which was, first year went to a place called the Dipsea Inn. So that's the origin of the name. The Dipsea Inn had just been built. And so that was the origin of it. And it's pretty much kept the same course with some modifications ever since. And people just love it. And once it gets in your blood, it's part of you.
Why is it called the Dipsea Race? Where did the name Dipsea come from?
Right. I'm glad you asked that because that was a mystery. A fellow named Mark Reese wrote the first history of it, and he didn't come up with the origin of it. It was unknown. But when I was writing a history of San Anselmo, my town, I came across an article with an interview of William Kent, who owned all this land that the race went over. And Marin owes so much to William Kent, including Muir Woods, Mount Tam State Park, Marin Municipal Water District, all directly due to him. This interview said he's the guy that built the Dipsea Inn on his land on what is now Stinson Beach. And he said the origin of it was a Rudyard Kipling shanty, Chantey, a something sailors sing, and it was deep sea in that shanty. I forget which number, I have it in the book. And that was what triggered him. This was 1905, and Rudyard Kipling had just won the Nobel Prize, was very much read at that time. So that is the origin of it. People have come up with different stories over the years, but that is right from William Kent's mouth.
What other stories have people come up with?
Well, that you're dipping into the sea, both from where you look from the high point, like you're coming down to dip into the sea, or that you take a dip in the sea when you finish. Those were the most prevalent theories, but he said it straight.
Actually, I didn't know. I didn't know that myself. How did you first get involved in the race yourself? Was it as a runner, as a volunteer?
Well, I was living in Marin and very active in the running world. I put on races. I raced myself. But somehow I did not tie into the Dipsea race for a little long. I moved here in 75 and to the Bay Area in 70, but I was not part of the Dipsea. But in 1981, a friend of mine named Keith Hastings, who won the very first Mount Tam hill climb, asked me to come along and give water. This is before there was a water station at Cardiac. And he had a good friend named Florian Harp, who we wanted to give water to at Cardiac. So I went with him, and we stayed by Lone Tree Spring. And there was Florian Harp so far ahead of everyone. She ended up winning, but she was not a good downhiller. So she had a monster lead at the top. And like, what is this race? It didn't even seem like a race. She was like 5 minutes ahead of everyone. But anyhow, then the others started coming, and I got caught up in the fever. And then I was known as a race announcer in the Bay Area. The Dipsea Race announcer, James Farron, died of cancer, a young man. He was in his early 30s. So, and now Farron's Rest, people illegally spread their ashes on that stretch that's between Cardiac and Lone Tree. It's called Farron's Rest. So they needed an announcer. One guy did it for 1 year, George Frazier, and then they gave it to me because I was an experienced race announcer. And I've never missed a year since.
That was like how soon? When did you start race announcing after the first time you?
82 was my first year. I remember Sal Vasquez winning. It was my first year.
Had you ever done it as a runner?
I have never raced the Dipsea. I have run 3 quad Dipseas. There used to be a practice Dipsea. Maybe there still is an official race called the practice Dipsea. I did at least 15 of those and many, many double Dipseas. But I have never done the Dipsea. But what I did do, beside those, before the race and before I had children, I would run over in the morning. And there used to be showers that worked there. Maybe they still, there was a time they didn't. Maybe they're working now again. That was the sweetest thing on earth. I had a buddy I used to run with, and there was no one out there, of course. This was 6, we met at 6 or something. The sun is rising, no one out there. You knew the anticipation that was coming. It was just sweet. But then I had children, and then they moved the race earlier. It used to start at 9, then 8:30, then 8, and I got slower, and then the showers didn't work, so I couldn't do that anymore.
So the Dipsea has been going on for 114 years, but you also mentioned, that's the original, you also mentioned the double Dipsea and the quad Dipsea. Do you want to just talk for a bit about what is the double Dipsea and what is the quad Dipsea?
Well, a very great man named Walt Stack, people are forgetting, he was a pioneer at the beginning of the running boom because he was an older man then, in the 60s and 70s. He'd run across the Golden Gate Bridge bare-chested, very famous. He started the double Dipsea, and it is named after him, to start in Stinson, go to Mill Valley, and back. Also a handicapped race, so it's had many different winners. And then later, they thought of a quadruple Dipsea. John Mettinger was the main driving force behind that, and that's also now sold out and very popular. Not as many allowed in it as the Dipsea, but they've become popular offshoots.
Why? So now you've mentioned the Mount Tam hill climb. It's a very old race. The Dipsea, obviously, very old race. The double Dipsea's been around a long time. Why, across the US, why does Marin County and Mill Valley and Mount Tam have so many of these iconic running events, trail running events. Why do you think, why do you think it's such a hotbed for it and such a historical place for trail running in the U.S.?
That's a good question, which I have not really thought that much about, but I come back to William Kent. The answer to your question is we have so much open space, and it's due to him. We are so near San Francisco, I mean, connected by a bridge, yet more than half this county is public open space, and another huge chunk is open space in agricultural lands. So we just have the public open space near a population center, so naturally you would want to have races here. And it wasn't as hard to get permits in the old days as it is now, but I would think that's the answer to your question.
And to keep on the history of the Dipsea Race, talk to us about kind of how it is, some of these little quirky oddities of the Dipsea Race and how they've kind of evolved over the last 114 years, like the handicap, like the entry system. Yeah, I'll stop and ask you some specific questions throughout that. But talk to us about the kind of quirks and oddities and what makes this race unique.
Right. First, you've mentioned 114, and we talked about 1905. I want to explain that because that's 120. The Dipsea has missed 6 years. 2 in the 30s when we had the Great Depression, and then 4 in World War II when there was a large military presence on Mount Tam, and there's still some evidence of that. And then I'm trying to remember, did we miss during the pandemic? It was actually missed? Okay, so then there would be a 7th year. So that's the origin of the discrepancy there. But the quirks, number one is probably the handicaps. And you from the British Isles would know more about that. I have a hunch that maybe that happens more, maybe not. Because I haven't found a history of handicapped racing in this country. And I need to explain the difference. Originally, I don't know who came up with the idea of handicapping it in the first place. It was staged by the Olympic Club, the oldest athletic club in the United States, based in San Francisco. But somebody got the idea to handicap, meaning people would start ahead of other people based on a handicapper's assessment of your ability. And that made it possible for anyone at the starting line to think they could win. And this is a very important point that most people don't grasp. That changed in 1965. The running boom was starting. There got to be so many runners, they couldn't individually assess everybody. So they made it by age, strictly by age. And then when women were allowed in 1971, age and gender. So now, not everyone on the starting line thinks they could win. You have to be the best among your age and gender to have a chance to win. And that's a point that I really want to emphasize, because for the first till 1960 years, anyone thought they could win, and indeed, there were shockers. You read the newspaper accounts, total unknown wins, and now every winner is tops in their age group and well known. So that's a big shift.
When they did that big shift, like before that, was there much less participants and that they were able to handle the handicapping? How many people were in
Right.
the earlier
They never got up to, I think one year there was over 100 in the 20s. But basically the number of entrants did not exceed 100 until the 60s.
Okay.
And then it went up exponentially. It quickly got over 1,000. And then by 1970, 76, it got so big, over 2,000, that it just got too big. They couldn't, the line at the finish line was so great, the results of 76 are still unreliable. And people used to talk about trying to resolve the 76 results, but I don't think anybody wants to do that. So then they put limits on the number of entrants, and they were started 2 sections, limiting it. The first section called the Invitational, and the second section called the Runner. The names have changed a little, but to 1,500 total. Briefly, they was going to have a third section, but they never had it. So that's about explain.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the 2 sections, the Invitational and the Runners? What is that? What's the difference?
Well, as I say, they started that's new. It's new with 76. Is that new anymore? 77. But in 77, to appease. All right, I'll go back a tiny bit. I told you 76 was the peak year of entrants. So many that they couldn't record them. And it was a mess. And the National Park Service had just taken over William Kent's old land. His family didn't own it anymore, but it was his old land. And they said, this is too much. You guys are trampling, needless to say, the pass, and people went all over the place. And so they said, we need to control this. And they actually, and it tied up the town of Stinson Beach. You couldn't get out of, the emergency vehicles couldn't get out. It did need some control. It couldn't keep going up exponentially. So there was a vote of the Board of Supervisors to kill the race. But they reached these compromises. The date would move from August, late August, which was the height of the fire season, to early June, second Sunday in June, that they would limit the number of runners and split them in sections, 2 sections. The first one being the Invitational, being the only ones that would get trophies, and then the second one, which would just be for the rest of the field. So they made those, and they also eliminated several historic shortcuts. And those compromises were agreed upon, and the race survived. And
how has that changed over the years, the shortcuts, from like the earliest days to now?
I know. I mean, I tried to research some of these earliest ones. I can't say I know everyone that did. Our greatest link was Jack Kirk, who started running in Dipsea Demon. He started running in 1929 or 30, and he had a memory of this, and he lived to be 100, and his mind was sharp. So he was the greatest link to what really went on in the early days. But, I mean, they didn't call them shortcuts then, because that was the route. It's what got limited, then they became shortcuts. But it was definitely shorter. Not the first year. The first year, the race finished at the Dipsea Inn, which was 1.3 miles on the sand, and that was considered inhumane. I mean, they literally were dropping after, as you know, you've done the Dipsea, you're pretty tired by the time you get to the finish line, and then to do 1.3 miles on the sand competitively. But so there have been some course changes over the years, and but it's always started at where it starts today, right at the depot, which was where the Mill Valley train depot, and it's always finished in what is now Stinson Beach, and it's always gone over Cardiac, and so the essential elements are still there.
Actually, I would love to, I think this could be useful for us. Talk us through the race course, starting at the depot. all the way to the finish line, and
Okay.
the names, the descriptions,
Okay.
and the different features.
Right. I love that they have colorful names. Well, you start by this clock that was only put up in 1929. The start has moved a few feet. It was in a flagpole, but basically you start by what's called Lytton Square. And Barbara Lytton was a Mill Valley young man who died in World War I, which is called the Great War. And so they named the square for him. And then you run up Throckmorton Avenue, and Throckmorton was the guy that developed Mill Valley, Samuel Throckmorton. He once owned it, and his company developed it in the 1880s, and it opened in 1890, incorporated in 1900. So you run up this street, and then I love to say you cut through Old Mill Park, and some people go to the left of the bathrooms that are there, and some people go to the right, and they debate which is quicker. And then you come to one of the first real distinct features, maybe the most distinct, the steps. The number has varied, and the last I counted was 686, I think. But when this Jack Kirk made a famous line, there were 671, and his quote was, "Old Dipsea runners never die, they just reach the 672nd step." But the number of steps have changed. But these steps were built so that residents along the way could walk down to the train station. So they had these steps, and it's brutal. And so soon in the race, and also because it's handicapped, by the time the hot shots reach it, it's often crowded with people struggling to get up. And many people have made the mistake of working too hard on those steps and have nothing left for more brutality ahead. So you reach the top of the steps, and there's a little more uphill, up what's now called Bayview. They used to go through what's called the Flying Y Ranch, and I remember that. It was a horse ranch. Now it has some luxury homes, and you go up a little more to what's called Windy Gap, which is panoramic highway. You cross it. And that is the end of the first uphill. And in the old days, you used to go straight down to Muir Woods, straight. I've never done this. I've never even tried it, because they built some homes. And for the first years in the 60s, runners tried to get through those homes. And there's a famous story of Norman Bright, one of the great champions, befriending the dog that guarded it so he could go through. But it was a plunge down. But finally the Dipsea gave in and built it. You now go to the right when you crest the hill and go down the dedicated Dipsea Trail. And that's quite a drop down to the Muir Woods Road. And then you have on a tricky trail, but then you could finally start running down the Muir Woods Road, actually running as fast as you can. And then you cut down at the mailboxes, and there's been many shortcuts. Some famous guys have come up with ways to cut that. And that goes through an area that's little known in Marin, Druid Heights. I just saw a show about it where the hippies used to have, Allen Ginsberg lived there and many other famous beatniks. But anyhow, the runners don't pay any attention to that. And they just plunge down, very steep again, to the Muir Woods Road. And you then have to cross Redwood Creek.
What's the name of the shortcut before? Suicide?
Suicide, that's right. Right when you, at the mailboxes, you plunge down Suicide. Just to give you an example of the names, and it's pretty steep. When I did all my other Dipsea runs, I would never take Suicide. I would take the little safer official route. But of course, people like you would take Suicide. And so then you hit the Muir Woods Road, and you cross it and you face Redwood Creek, which runs right through Muir Woods National Monument. And the story of that bridge is quite a story. There's been a few different bridges across. And the one that was there during my early decades of involvement with the race got washed away in a flood of 80. We had a terrific flood in 81, or January of 82, and it got washed away. And there is no bridge, no permanent bridge. And this is you're granting me this time to talk, and I will rant and rave. Why is there no bridge? Dipsea Trail is the most popular and used trail in Marin and one of the most famous in the state, even in the nation. And you're crossing Redwood Creek, which they're really trying to preserve the salmon run, which is very much threatened. Why is there no bridge? This is now 43 years without a bridge there. Anyhow, you cross the bridge and go up a section called Dynamite, which has had significant changes. You used to take a more direct route up. You're now beginning the main climb, the second climb, which is bigger than the first. There used to be direct routes up, but Muir Woods allows no shortcuts whatsoever now, so you have to stay on the Dipsea Trail. And so it's still a tough climb, even though it's a little more switchback than it used to be. And then you finally get into open space. There used to be grazing up there, so it was really open when you crested out of when you left Muir Woods National Monument boundaries. It was really open. There were stiles with fences to keep cattle in and I have pictures in the book of runners having to either jump over them or go the conventional way through them. Now, since there's been no grazing, there's a lot more trees than there were up until the 60s and 70s. So now it looks a little different. Still, though, clearly more open, and you still can see the ocean. First time you could see the ocean, your goal. And then you go through past Halfway Rock, which was named by Russ Kiernan. It was halfway to him because it's not really halfway in distance or halfway in time for most people, but because he was so unusual, he's one of the greatest of all Dipsea champions in the Hall of Famer. He was the great downhiller, so for him that was halfway in time, but for most people, not the same. But anyhow, it's called Halfway Rock, and you run over the moors. No, we're not yet at the moors. Still, you can see Mount Tam and you can see the ocean. And then you enter what used to be called Kent's Deer Park. He had kept it pristine. There's redwoods, beautiful section. And then you head toward the final uphill called Cardiac, and that was named by Don Pickett. I may be wrong, but I think he's the one that named it. It's a last uphill that famously a guy named Joe King, who won the race in the 80s twice, missed it that turn once and took the fire road up to what's called Cardiac, the highest point. And we know it's the highest point because Jerry Hauke, who I can't tell you how important he was, he directed the race for 33 years. And there's a park in Mill Valley named after him. A great man, truly a great man. He was surveying skills. So one day, to settle whether the highest point was the top of Cardiac or Lone Tree, which I'm going to come to, we went up there, and it was one of the sweetest nights I've had. Late afternoon, we went up there. He set it up. I was called a rod man, holding the rod on the other end, and he proved that it was 6 inches higher at Cardiac than at Lone Tree. So anyhow, after Lone Tree, at Cardiac, you now have water station, and people refresh there, and it's downhill then. Not all, there's still a little upcoming, but it's downhill. And you go over what I told you was Farron's Rest, this short stretch till you get to the historic Lone Tree. And in old pictures, there really was one redwood tree there on that hill. Now it is covered with Douglas fir trees, but that redwood is still there. And then things start to get, and then you're still on a section that's now not really named. They call it Overlook, I think. I've never really embraced that. And you're still up in clear land. And then things really changed over the years. They used to take a very different route than what they do now. And I don't fully understand what they did. Jack Kirk said they just plunged down steep ravine in a totally different way. They went beyond what we call the swoop.
To the right or to the left of it?
They went to the left of the swoop and just plunged down something to get to where we're going to go. But now we go down a very hairy section called the swoop, and it's wonderful that it's still open because there is an alternate route. That the official Dipsea Trail is called the Gale Scott Trail because Gale Scott, who had won in 1986, mistakenly took it in 1987, and it is longer, and she finished second. So now it's called unofficially the Gale Scott Trail. It is the official Dipsea Trail, but most hotshots take the swoop, which is very steep, and come out on a section called Steep Ravine. It is not the Steep Ravine Trail. It is the Dipsea Trail. There is a separate Steep Ravine Trail in the same canyon. So you come down the steep, and you begin these hundreds of steps. I counted them. And I am a decent uphill runner, but a terrible downhill runner. And I am terrified. I don't understand how people can run down steep ravine. I truly do not. And they fly down. You're one of them. Nobody filmed there for a long time because it was considered too dangerous to divert people with a camera. But then Tim Amick started filming. And one thing I remember so vividly, besides seeing people who could jump 4 steps at a time and glide down, which is truly a gift, there was a young man in his 20s, maybe even shirtless, the happiest guy in the world, flying down. And then you see him land his ankle at 90 degrees, and he wasn't so happy anymore. He heard the scream, and that has stayed in my mind, the dangers of steep ravine. And as I say, I still don't understand how you guys do it. So you then cross Webb Creek, which carves steep ravine, and there's a bridge there. And then you have your final uphill called Insult, and I forget who named it, came up with that name, but it is considered an insult after all the hopes of just nothing but down. You have this one last up, and we've seen winners of the race walking up that section. And then you come to what's now the most recent controversial part of it. When you crested this uphill called Insult, used to go right onto Panoramic Highway onto the original Dipsea course that was there in 1905. And it was deeded as a Dipsea right-of-way by the last private landowner, George Leonard. And we've seen that deed. But and you would cut on the road and off the road on some shortcuts called doorway number 1 and doorway number 2, and it was pretty, you could open your legs up running on Panoramic Highway, and then you'd have these very hairy shortcuts, but it was definitely the fastest way down. But a few years ago, the Park Service decided you cannot go on the road anymore. It was very abrupt. The runners did not even know it until they got there. So now you must run on the moors. Now, I told you I'm not much of a downhiller, so I would always run on the moors because the other one was too scary. But now everyone runs on the moors, which does add one more uphill. Not quite as tough as Insult, but one more uphill. It is beautiful, the moors. We'll say that for it, but it is longer. And then you plunge down into more heavy vegetation. There used to be some other shortcuts as you got near Moose Hill, all closed off now. And a beautiful section that has ocean influence, lots of vegetation. And then you come to, I wouldn't even mention it, but it has such a beautiful name. Just as you're getting close to Highway 1, you have to veer left to jump over a stile instead of going right, which is the more direct way, but which would block Highway 1 if all the runners took it. But some years ago, a very good runner who was headed for a black shirt got confused there and did veer right instead of left. And his name was Rod Teeple. And George Fraser, this wit, still calls it Teeple's choice, the Teeple's choice. And he got disqualified. He would have won a pretty good numbered shirt. So you then have to go over the stile and plunge. I don't know how many feet it is, 10 feet. And that is where if you like to watch people in trouble, spectators line up there because people fall there. I mean, it's hairy. And some people offer their hand to help people. It's pretty hairy, that last little jump over the stile and onto the road. Then you start flying. Used to so then you go right into the town of Stinson Beach, and used to finish right in central Stinson Beach in front of what is now a market. Some years they'd let you turn left sooner. Now you have to kind of go past the finish line, take a left, and then another left, and run a final straightaway to the finish line. I know that's quite a mouthful, but it is a complicated course.
When you take that left turn, you can start hearing your voice announcing the distance.
I've heard you can hear it when you hit Highway 1, no?
I'm too blacked out then.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I don't hear a lot of things. Tunnel vision.
Well, you just reminded me of something that I did want to say. I've been the announcer all these years, and it's been wonderful. But what I've never gotten to experience is a sprint, a two-person sprint on the straightaway. There's never been a pass for first place on that straightaway. There has been for other places, of course, but never for first. And one day I would love to see that.
I'll try my best this year. Okay, so let's talk about, I don't know, what's your favorite Dipsea memory?
Well, I don't know how much film is in this camera, but one that stands out, and Tim Amix, who I think you're going to interview, the videographer for the race, used it as the start of his initial film. This guy I mentioned, George Fraser, was very involved with the race, a good friend, beloved figure in Marin running. And he had famously finished 36, one out of the black shirts, which we haven't talked about blacks, but they give 35 black numbered shirts. He had, I think, 3 black 36s. And he was headed toward a similar fate on the final straightaway when two runners ahead of him collapsed. One literally collapsed. One staggering and one literally collapsing. And I correctly called George Fraser. Fraser wins the last shirt. It was, you couldn't have scripted it any better. I mean, he was facing 37, and this gift came, poor the other guys, and he got the 35. I was really in top form, if I must say so. Other ones, I mean, every time we called Jack Kirk, he used to come in, this Dipsea demon who ran 68 straight Dipseas and ran his last one at 95 or so. He was a legend. Every time I'd call, he would come in kind of in the pack in my early years, but then we would wait and wait and wait. But calling his name was always, I mean, everyone from the awards ceremony, the picnic tables would all come and watch him come in, and that was very emotional.
Who's your Dipsea hero?
Well, Norman Bright. Can I tell you the story of Norman Bright? When I started working on my book, what got me prompted to write it is a San Anselmo guy named Paul Chironi, who won the race in 37 with Norman Bright second, just died. And we had a service in my town. And I said, I got to interview these people before they all die. And so the first person I looked for was Norman Bright, who had set the course record in 1935 that stood for 35 years. And he raced Zamparini. He was friends with Zamparini, the guy that got famous. What's the name of that movie they made about him in World War II? He was a World War II prisoner of war, and he was an Olympian. They just made a movie about him. I can't, if one of you remembers, hopefully I'll remember it. And I got more about that. Anyhow, so I search out Norman Bright. I find out he's in a old age home in Seattle, outside Seattle, and he's blind. He had failing vision even in his younger years. And I go in with trepidation. What is going to be? How is this going to go? And he just greets me so warmly and shares everything. All his trophies had been stolen because he's blind, so they just steal everything. But his mind was as sharp as could be. And I brought him, Tamalpais runners, the local running club, financed a trip that I arranged to bring him back to the Dipsea. As I said, he was in his 80s and blind. And Russ Kiernan led a group to walk him over the Dipsea one last time. It took him, I did a little of it, but Russ was the real hard worker, something like 5 hours. And he stripped naked and went into the ocean. And he was so happy. And then he would come a couple of times, and then he died. And then they made this movie about, I can't believe I'm forgetting the name of this movie. You've all heard of it. But anyhow, Norman Bright's sister, Angelina Jolie, directed the movie, produced the movie that we're talking about. Unbroken. There you go. I read the book. Anyhow, Angelina Jolie made a movie about this Zamparini guy who was a prisoner of war. And Norman Bright and he were friends in the 36 Olympic trials. Norman Bright finished fourth, Zamparini third, and he made the team. Norman didn't. Norman was injured, but they were friends. And he was in the movie. He was in the book. And this sister, who was in her 90s, called me and said, can I go to the opening night in Hollywood? And I tried to reach, she wanted to know whether they had Norman Bright's red hair. They got his red hair right. And so she wanted to go. And I tried reaching out to Angelina Jolie and failed. And they never brought her out. And he wasn't in the movie anyhow, as it turned out. But anyhow, Norman Bright became a close, he would call so many times, and we would talk for hours and hours. He was a great man. He went to Stanford. He held the course record at Beta Breakers for 33 years, I think. Anyhow, he's a charter member of the Dipsea Race Hall of Fame.
Okay, so can you talk a little bit about the Dipsea community? Kind of why is it important for everyone from like the front runners, but all the way to the people in the back of the pack?
Well, as I say, I've never run it, so, but I assume they all realize what they've been through. From the first to the last, they realize they've been through something, and that they've been through a challenge, and it's something they'll talk about and tell their kids, and that they faced something and they did it. And I imagine that creates a bond that doesn't go away. That's my theory to that question.
So in the or actually in the earlier days, I guess, there was the women's hike. Talk to us about the women's hike through to women's participation in the event. How that's changed over the years.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is really the most significant part of the Dipsea history. As people nowadays don't know, women were not allowed to participate in sports across the board. I think they allowed women into the Olympics in swimming in 1920. They allowed track in 1924. No cross-country races for sure. Very limited opportunities for women. But there was a newspaper guy who didn't think that was right, and he created what's called the Dipsea Women's Hike. They had to call it a hike because you weren't allowed to have a race. So it was called a hike, but it actually had more participants than the Dipsea Race. The times were wonderful, comparable to what a fine woman runner would run today, yet in boots and heavy clothes. I mean, the boots alone, imagine how much that would add to your time. I think the record was 112, and nowadays 112 will get you into invitational for sure, and higher than that. So this went on for 5 years, and I must say, another real highlight that needs to be mentioned, I created a revival of this. And we had a 75th the first women's hike was in 1918, so 75 years later, 1993, I created a women's hike for the 75th. Then I did another one for the 100th. And for that 100th, the daughter of the first winner was present. This is hard to grasp. The winner from 1918, the daughter came in 2018 and was present at this. This not only shows what the Dipsea community, what the families involved, it was very special. And this event was so wonderful. People dressed up in Dipsea in old gear, and it was non-competitive, so it was just, a story that I must put in or I get clobbered. I called the Boston Marathon because you'd see these old numbers, and they looked like they're from that era. They looked hand-drawn. And I called Boston, And the lady was very nice, sent me samples. So we made hand-drawn numbers, 500 of them, actually 600 to have a little spare. We were allowed 500 entrants. This job went to my daughter, Sally. She got paid a little. She was a high schooler, and maybe just college. I think she just started college. Wow, she's an artist. They made the race. The numbers made the race, made you feel like you were back in another, to have hand, but that project was a monster. Finally, we had to call in other people, but hand doing those numbers was an epic part of our family. Anyhow, so we need to have more of these women's hike. They were so, so special. And after 5 years, they were stopped because people thought it was unseemly, that women's reproductive systems would be harmed by that kind of strenuous activity. Church people were not happy about it. The guy that organized it, I believe, died, so it just faded away. And women were not allowed to run the Boston Marathon, as you know, till the 70s. But if the Dipsea was more lenient, they let women sneak in the 40s, as late as the 40s, and in the 50s, women were sneaking in. And then in the 60s, they didn't even need to sneak in. They were not allowed to be official entrants, but they were allowed to go to the starting line and run the full thing and appear in the results. And then finally, the big incident at Boston with Kathy Switzer when she was entered as Kay Switzer, and the race director during the race tried to tackle her, and her boyfriend got in the way, and she finished. And there was a big movement that it's time for women to run in races. And so the Dipsea allowed women in 1971 officially. But it has this history that is really, really special.
So then, what is the history of? Oh no, actually, I guess you want to say. Were you saying you want to go down?
Maybe like ask the access question just to kind of see where that.
I don't know. Do you think the Dipsea has or can improve access to the sport of trail running? How do you think the Dipsea could improve that?
That's a tough one.
I guess like in the earlier days, like it was one of the first races that let women into it.
Right. You'd also need to understand how hard it was to stage this race in 1905. Cars were just beginning, and there basically were no cars or roads. And so all the officials had to hike over the night before and spend the night at the Dipsea Inn. Radio was just beginning, but really not there. So there was no communication. And I still don't understand how they sync their watches. I really don't. There were all these fences, all of it was private property, all of it. So that it was very hard to stage this. But they pulled it off, and I guess it showed what was possible. I read the Chronicle and Examiner reports. They thought it would be impossible to stage this race, but they pulled it off. And so it showed what was possible, and I don't know why more races haven't gotten into the handicap side of it, because we've had so many children's winners, seniors over 60, now over 70 we've had, women. It makes for a very exciting race. And so they're pioneers in cross-country racing, yes.
So then, what's the history of youth participation in the event? When did kids start doing the event?
Well, that's relatively recent. although I'm talking 60 years, you had to be, I think, 18 to run in the, or 17, because the first winner was a high schooler, John Hassard, I mentioned him. So I think it was either 16 or 17 or 18 over the years was the minimum age. And then somehow they stopped paying attention to that. And Marietta Boitano was 5 when she first ran. She tried to run it at 4, but they realized that was just a little much. But she ran it at 5, and then she won it at 10, I believe. And there were other a guy named Vance Eberly won it at 11, I believe. And so this just kind of happened with the running, lack of enforcement. I mean, it may still have, I don't think it was in the rules one way or another. Now they've come back, and now you have to be all of 8, I believe, to enter.
7, I think.
7 now? So that tradition started in the 60s. And Marietta Boitano and her family, her brother won it at age 10 or 11 with an unbelievable time. In my opinion, one of the greatest performances. I don't have the numbers in my mind. It was 56 something at age 11, which is really pretty phenomenal. And so that family had most to do with bringing it in. And then a girl named Megan McGowan really turned the whole thing around. She won twice in a row at 8 or 9. She won the best time award for the women at age 9, I think, or 10. Where does that stand among the greatest achievements? And so youth have a real special place in this. Something has turned around now because you don't have these youngsters barely even getting a shirt anymore, certainly not in the top. So the handicaps are,
Why do you think that's the case? Why do you think it's turned? Why do you think youth are less prevalent in it now?
Well, I think that we didn't realize what they were capable of in those days, so they got a pretty nice handicap. I mean, they did do fabulous times, but now those pioneers, Mike Boitano and Megan McGowan, have raised the bar so high, people can do that. Kids can do that, so not many kids can do that. So it's tough for the new generation to match those standards.
Maybe you've already answered this, but any favorite memories of young athletes at the Dipsea?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time with Megan McGowan. She came down with her father, came up. They lived in Southern California, and they would come practice, and we would have them for dinner, and he even gave me a massage. He was a massage therapist. We got to know the family, and she was a special young lady, and she was in a battle. Both years were real battles and stunning upsets, including beating Sal Vasquez one year. One year he tracked her down, and that was very famous. She was second. Her first year, she was second, then first, and first. Sal tracked her down. That was one of the most dramatic years because he was well behind when we got a late report, but he tracked her down and then famously lifted her up at the awards ceremony, held her, this 8-year-old, and that was very, very emotional time. And then she turned the tables. One year he didn't run, but one year she actually beat him. And so and then more recently, a lady named Riley Johnson won at age 9 or so. beating my dear friend Melody Ann Schultz, who was that time 60-something, and they had an entire race battle in one another in sight, but youth prevailed in the final sprint, basically. So that was pretty good to call.
That was the 100th year of the race as well. That was, I think.
That was the 100th, yeah, right. That was the last one in the updated book I wrote, yes.
You'd mentioned.
Can I ask one?
Yeah.
How do you think it changes the community of the event, the spirit of the event, that, and like this is largely about the handicap system, but like that you have young people who are in the race in the first place, but also are competitive and can win, and you have them going toe-to-toe with a 6-year-old. Just like, how does that change the feeling or the community?
That's a good point. I left something out. Megan McGowan was allowed to have a pacer, and a guy named Bruce Finney paced her in the year she won and before. And that became very controversial. The pacing was for safety, for her safety, for all kids' safety. That, they eliminated that. You cannot, the kids have to run by themselves. I mean, a father or mother could give up their handicap or whatever and run with them if they're entered in the race. It could wait for them or whatever, but you cannot have a pacer like you have now. But the youth angle that you mentioned makes families come together. That the Tunzing family, with Tuinzing, which is very well known in Marin County because Case Tunzing founded the Tamalpais Runners, which won the first 30 Dipsea team trophies. He became the first known 3-generation family with his mom, Els, who ran when she was in her 70s and is in the Hall of Fame, Case, and then their son, and I have a picture of them. So it started becoming a multi-generational thing, and now it's very common for at least mother and son, father, daughter, to have that. So that adds a lot, and I can imagine how those families enjoy the run-up to the race, and it's a very nice part of it.
You'd mentioned Sal Vasquez. Talk to us about who is Sal Vasquez, what has he done in the race, and how has he impacted the race?
Right. I'm often asked to rank the greatest Dipsea runners of all time, and it's a very tricky question. He certainly is a candidate, and probably would get my vote as number one. He had a rough background. He grew up in Mexico. He was a soccer player, and he had a drinking problem, and he told me all this, and he actually had an accident when he had his kid in the car, and when he was drunk, and he realized, no more, I can't do this. So running was booming. He started running, immediately took to it. Within a year, he was nationally ranked. This was when he was around 38, 39. And somehow, he lived in the East Bay, some of his East Bay buddies got him into the Dipsea. Immediately took to that. He is a downhill, that guy can run downhill, and he also can run uphill. And he just came on the scene, and he won 7 times. The record had been 2. The record had been 2 up to that point, because they would change your handicap and punish anyone who ever won the race. So, but now we were in the year of by age, so you just couldn't do anything. I mean, he would get the same amount of minutes. So they finally had to stop him. They put in what's called the Sal Vasquez rule, where the previous winner would get penalized. And they went through a few iterations of that, how much it was and how long it would last. But that continues to this day, where the previous winner and now the previous 3 winners all lose a little bit of handicap. But that was the only way to stop him. That's how great he was. He won the best time award at age, as I say, all of these may be off by a year or two. I hope you realize that. But I believe at 49, he won the best time award the year he won. And that is certainly one of the greatest Dipsea achievements ever. The next winner of the best time award, I believe, is 37, next oldest. So he's a charter member of the Hall of Fame, and then he got injured, and he hasn't come back. He's still around though, and he comes to reunions and to special occasions, but he took the race by storm, and now sure other people. Shirley Matson has won it 4 times, and Brian Pilcher, I believe, has won it 4 times. But when he did it, the record was 2, and he went to 7.
Yeah, he still comes back to hike the Dipsea Trail every year.
Right. Sal Vasquez is winning the best time award in the mid-40s. His mid-40s is one of the greatest achievements. But there are others.
Can I ask you a quick question, Patty? It feels really unique that the Dipsea tries to get Sal Vasquez to lose. Like, the Boston Marathon doesn't give you a handicap if you win. Like, other races don't give you a handicap if you win, or if you're faster. Like, they want the fastest person to win. What do you think it says about what the race is trying to do, the community is trying to build, the purpose that it has, that it's actively trying to change,
To normalize.
who's at front, who's in the front?
That's a good question. They've always been doing that. If you won as I said, the handicaps were individually assigned until 1965. So if you won, you were going to get punished big time. And nobody won 2 years in a row. I think finally somebody did in the 50s. So that goes way back, that tradition. They want new winners. Once they had the handicap strictly by age and gender, there was no way of doing that anymore. And that Sal was quite capable maybe of winning 15 times. And maybe there's nothing wrong with that, but I guess somebody felt that that wasn't the best thing. I mean, I wasn't on the committee. That's a good point, whether you let somebody win, not let them, but make it possible for them to win so many times, or whether you want new faces up there. Just, I don't know what went behind that.
Okay. How's the Dipsea Race changed from your first experience to your most recent one? Not necessarily with regards to the trail or the management, but just from your own experience.
Yes, certainly the trail has changed. So it's been 40, that would be a stretch of 43 years. The time has moved earlier, making my life a little harder. There've been the battles. You know, the race doesn't get, I was told by recent race director, Etta Stickle, that they didn't get their permit till the day before the race a couple of times. The battles with the Park Service, I loved the national parks. I can't tell you the work I have done on behalf of parkland. The two can work together. It doesn't have to be a battle. So that has been very disturbing to hear. I'm not on the committee, so I don't know all that goes on, but I know there's battle. It's been very over when it could start, where it can go, and it just doesn't need to be. I want the Park Service to embrace this history. Of course, you must protect the environment. That's a given. You can work together. So that's what I've seen over the years, this seemingly increasingly inflexible positions. And the Dipsea has lost, with the death of Jerry Hauke, a real great leader. I know that doesn't come across very well but he was a giant, and the current directors would recognize that we had a giant against a giant, and now the Dipsea Race is a little in a lesser position in these battles than when we had Jerry Hauke.
So the last couple of questions now. How do you describe the Dipsea to people who've never heard of it?
I'd enjoy that question because I always wear my Dipsea hat when I travel, and including places. We enter this. My daughters live in Los Angeles, so we go in this turkey trot they have, which has 5,000 people, and some are walkers, some are runners, and I wear my Dipsea hat, and not a one this year, or last year, or the year before has ever said, "Hey, Dipsea." And I find, I wear it in New York. So rare does anybody, and it's wonderful when somebody says, "Oh, yeah, Dipsea." So we do need to get the word out there, and I'd like to feel I've helped somewhat in doing that. But again,
What's the one sentence about how you describe this race? And the weirdness and the uniqueness. And
well,
how do you describe
I always say there are 4 unique factors. One was, we mentioned the handicap, so it could be won by youth, young boys, young girls, old men, older women, and people in their prime. The second is the course, which is not only beautiful, but challenging and dangerous. That's the third element. It's dangerous. You run in a 10K, you're probably going to finish without going to the medical tent. But you run the Dipsea, you may end up in the medical tent, and a lot of people do. And then the history. It has this, it's over these years, you get these family stories. We just found the trophy from 1910 won by a high schooler from Oakland named John Hassard. His family still comes back, and they have his trophy. And you get these stories all the time. It's got a history that's living and enduring, and people embrace it.
What advice would you give to the youth that are competing in the Dipsea this year? If you were talking to them, you're going to be at the finish line, but if you were at the start line, you were talking to these kids, what advice would you give them?
They finish in better shape than the most adults. It's something, being that young, you rarely see. Most of them are smiling and happy and have a sprint. So they got something going that they should cherish there. And I can imagine they can go down the terrifying parts, to me, better than most of us. The standard advice is don't use all your energy going up the steps. You'll have time. These old folks will get tired more than you will. So save some of your energy. Be courteous, because you're shorter and you may not be just noticed as other people when you're coming up. but that you're starting something that you can have for the rest of your life. And I hear that from many people. You mentioned somebody who's planning on breaking Jack Kirk's record of 68 straight finishes, and you have that potential to finish 50 times or more. And that's a gift, and don't forget it.
I love that, Barry. That was brilliant. What do you think, and we talked about this when we did the interview down in a few years ago, what do you think the future of the Dipsea looks like? How do you think it can or should evolve, or how should it stay the same?
Yeah, I've wrestled with that. It seems I had an idea to get a local car dealer to offer a car to anyone breaking the course record. And that would bring in possibly some African runners who, outstanding cross-country, world-class runners, which this race does not. And it does not have any national class or world-class runners because it's so dangerous. There's no prize money, and it's in the middle of the season, of the peak track season. And so I had that idea, and I used to think that was a good idea, but now I'm not so sure. It seems the consensus is to keep it a local race. I do want to see some more famous names. A few years ago, I got a call from a distant friend, Amby Burfoot, who won the 1968 or 67 Boston Marathon and was editor of Runner's World. And he wanted to come. So I got together a bunch of friends here to show him the course. And that was very nice. And it came with his wife. And after it, his wife said, do not participate in this. Not even run it. Do not participate. And he was so, this is a great runner, has the credentials to win the race, because he was in his 60s then. He could not handle those downhills. And he finished like 500th in the invitation, one of the last invitationals. So, maybe it's not for everybody to open this up. Maybe it's just as the way it is. But I still like when we do get a surprise, really potentially outstanding national class runner to come. But I'm perfectly fine as it is, and who to let in is a big issue. I mean, it's always oversubscribed, and I'm not sure I favor letting Marin people in. Somehow with the mailing, they may have an advantage. I do want to see people throughout the country have a fair and equal shot to get in, because that adds a lot when I call the names, when I get so excited when I say Kentucky and Illinois and another country. That really gets me going, as opposed to Mill Valley, Corte Madera. So I would like to see some change in that.
We didn't actually ask you earlier about how do people get into the race? Does that process work? What's the story with the different entries? Describe that in a paragraph.
Right. I mean, I don't even know all what goes on now, but the entry form says you have to send it in early. That's for sure, right away. I mean, they open the entries. It's been around March 15th. I think it's creeping a little earlier. And now it's online. I think don't you have to fill, it is totally online?
No, you have to.
No, you still have to fill something out and mail it in, right. That's something that most runners do not understand. I believe most races you could do everything online. So you have to get to the mailbox quick. And people who have earned invitational status by finishing in the top 450 in the invitational the previous year get priority. They're guaranteed entry if they mail it in on time. And then there's a lottery for everybody else. I don't know whether they, turn their heads and pick names or whether how they actual pick those. Then you can buy your way in, and they never tell you how much is the minimum amount that'll get you in. And then you can write a sob story, they call it, where you explain why you should be in, that you have some horrible disease or your great-great-grandfather ran it or whatever, and some of those get in. And they fill them that way. And there's disappointed people. I know the Western States, which is another big California race, gives you a little preference if you miss. I don't think the Dipsea does that. You can keep missing until you finally get in, and then you got to run well, and then you'll get in again.
Yes, you have to write about it in your sub-letter.
Right.
Cool. That's through the list of my questions. Do either of you guys have any questions?
I wanted to mention one the greatest achievements. Something overlooked is running a time in minutes below your age. It's kind of an obscure thing, and maybe it doesn't mean anything, but you got to be pretty darn good to do that. And it wasn't achieved for many decades. And then it finally, as older participants, if you were in the 40s in the early days, you were remarked in the paper as an old. You were singled out as old. Now, of course, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s even with Jack Kirk. So it became more possible to run your time in minutes below your age. And a few people like Sal Vasquez, Russ Kiernan, very few have achieved that. But one woman got within 2 minutes of that, Melody Ann Schultz. And that's an achievement that has not been properly recognized. She's won the race 3 times. She's well honored. She's in the Hall of Fame. But that achievement, I forget which year, she was in her 60s. She ran within 2 minutes of her age. No woman has come close to that before or since. And running your age is now maybe impossible now that the course has been lengthened. So maybe we'll not see it again, but I just wanted to call that out.
Actually, one that just popped into my mind. Talk to us about the 2024 race, about Chris, about what happened in the 2024 race, last year's event.
Well, two top people, including you, dropped out. Now I forget who was the other one who was favored. There was another, somebody dropped out. And I do a predictions column in the Marin Independent Journal every year. And I have to say, the race is a bit predictable. And that makes me a little sad. That's why I want some new people. Yes, there's tremendous drama for the 35 black shirts, which you didn't talk about, and tremendous dramas all over the place. But it's not, I have predicted the winner way too many times, and that shouldn't be, in my opinion. It is it's less predictable than road races, don't get me wrong. In road races and track races, you could predict 1, 2, 3 and be right most of the time. But the Dipsea's becoming a little too that way, when it used to be total surprise. So, when these 2 top people dropped out, the candidates became very small, and Chris was clearly the best, and she came through. And I wasn't that surprised to get the reports as we get from the field. And give me one more thing. So that's my thoughts on that. But yeah, I have to throw one more thing in with Dipsea Bridge speech, the communications. I have read, I told you how hard it was to stage the race before radios, before Apple Watches and cell phones. They used to communicate, the leaders, using semaphores, which is a military signaling method, which I don't think the Army does it. I don't know if anybody in the Army knows how to do it anymore, but you remember them waving flags, two hand. That's how they would communicate. It was way less trees, so you could see from the finish line way high up, and they would communicate somehow who was leading. Now we get radio reports that are less reliable than the old semaphores. And I'm going to get in trouble, but I've said it to other people before. I think we could do better than that with chips. We have chips there. And anyhow, I'd love to have better, more reliable reports, because a lot of people at the finish line love to hear how the race is going.
I think you got it wrong when I won. When I came around the corner, you weren't expecting me because you were expecting Chris and Diana.
Right. So there's my rant.
Yeah. The one thing we mentioned a couple of times and we actually haven't described it. Talk to us about the black shirt.
Okay, well, it sounds fantastical, but I believe it's a true story that they they used to give the shirts. They decided to give. Right, the finish line was, I told you, in the 70s, backed up bedlam. So to keep order, they had the brilliant idea of throwing a numbered shirt on you, and that's the way they would do it. Well, because it was triggered by a fellow named Peter Eisenberg, who was legitimately 35th, but some unofficial runner was came through the chute, and he was 36. So they realized they needed to have order. So they would put these shirts on, and they decided on the number because they got a deal on 3 dozen. So they got 36 shirts, and they print the 0, which they don't give out. And the first year they were not black. They were yellow, and then they settled on black. And these have become the most treasured thing because really only 2 or 3 people think they could win the race. But a vast number more feel they could have a shot at someday getting a black shirt. And so that has become a real integral part of the race. And other races have now copied that. And at the awards ceremony, they come up one by one wearing the shirt backwards with the number on front. And it's just a very, very special part of the race.
Just give us a one-liner. The Dipsea Black Shirt is an award for the top 35 runners.
Right. The Dipsea Black Shirts, the top 35 runners are given black shirts, and it is very competitive. Often, it's one of my favorite parts of the race. My wife, Pam, counts on a yellow tablet how many have come in. So I'm saying 28, 29, 30. 4 more shirts left, and they're on the straightaway, and they know it, and they hear it. And that creates a real battle, and somebody's happy and somebody isn't happy. So that's wonderful.
We'll interview Carolyn later, and she's been in a couple of battles for that 35th spot, so that would be great. But also Andre, one of our young guys, he has a goal of sometime in the next couple of years he wants a black shirt. I think he's saying top 100 this year, but black shirt in a couple of years. Cool.
Okay.
That was great.
Thank you.
An ultra marathon of an interview.
Yes.